Start with the most dramatic moment, federal agents surrounding the HOA meeting, then rewind to tell the story. The autumn leaves were falling the day I inherited my grandfather's property in Meadowbrook Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside Charlotte. My name is Marcus Hayes, and I'm a 34-year-old software developer who never imagined I'd be at the center of a legal battle that would expose one of the most shocking conspiracies in our county's history. My grandfather, Samuel Hayes, had owned this 5-acre property since 1962, long before the housing development sprouted up around it in the late 1990s. The barn on the property wasn't just any barn. It was a beautiful post and beam structure built in 1947 with weathered red paint and a cupola that caught the morning sun. To me, it represented family history, summer days helping Grandpa restore vintage cars, and the smell of hay mixed with motor oil. But to the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, it was an eyesore that needed to go. 3 weeks after Grandpa's funeral, I received the first letter. The envelope was cream-colored, embossed with the HOA seal, and the contents were coldly professional. "Dear Mr. Hayes," it began, "it has come to our attention that the structure commonly referred to as the barn on your property at 1847 Heritage Lane does not conform to our community aesthetic standards. Per Section 7.3 of the HOA Covenant, you have 30 days to submit plans for demolition or face daily fines of $500. I remember sitting at Grandpa's old kitchen table, the letter trembling in my hands. $500 a day? For a barn that had been there decades before their precious HOA even existed? My attorney, Jennifer Collins, a sharp woman in her 40s with steel-gray eyes, reviewed my case with growing concern. "Marcus, your property predates the HOA by 35 years. You should be grandfathered in under property law, but HOAs have become increasingly aggressive, and they have deeper pockets than most individual homeowners." The HOA president was a woman named Victoria Ashford, a former real estate developer in her late 50s with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a smile that never reached her eyes. At our first meeting in the community center, she sat across from me flanked by 2 board members, Richard Pemberton, a retired banker with wire-rimmed glasses, and Diana Sutton, a corporate attorney who kept checking her Rolex. "Mr. Hayes," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "we understand your emotional attachment, but Meadowbrook Estates is a premier community. Property values are our priority. That barn brings down the entire neighborhood aesthetic." I tried to reason with them, explaining the barn's historical significance, its structural integrity, even offering to repaint it. But Victoria's expression hardened. "We're not interested in compromises. The barn goes, or you'll wish it had." That threat felt personal, menacing. I left that meeting with a knot in my stomach, wondering what kind of people prioritized aesthetics over heritage and human decency. Little did I know I was about to uncover something far more sinister than HOA overreach. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Grandpa's stories of building that barn, of the community that once existed before subdivisions and covenants. I walked out to the barn under moonlight, running my hand along the worn wood. That's when I noticed something odd. Fresh tire tracks in the mud near the barn's side entrance, tracks that definitely weren't mine. My neighbor, an elderly veteran named Frank Morrison, caught me inspecting the tracks the next morning. Frank had lived in the original farmhouse next door since 1985, before the development consumed the area. "You need to be careful, son," he said, his weathered face serious. "That HOA, they're not what they seem. 3 families tried to fight them before you. All 3 suddenly sold their properties at a loss and moved away. Something's not right." The fines started accumulating immediately, $500 per day, just as they'd threatened. Within 2 weeks, I owed $7,000. Jennifer filed an injunction, but the judge, surprisingly, sided with the HOA, claiming their covenant superseded grandfathering protections due to some obscure legal technicality I didn't understand. "This doesn't make sense," Jennifer said after the hearing, flipping through case files in her cramped office. "I've practiced property law for 18 years. This ruling contradicts established precedent. Unless—" She paused, her eyes widening. "Unless someone got to the judge." That night, I received an anonymous email from an account called Meadowbrook Truth with the subject line, "They want your land. The barn is just the excuse." The email contained no message, just an attachment, a blurry photograph of Victoria Ashford shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit outside a downtown office building. The sign behind them read Titanium Development Corporation. I didn't understand what I was looking at yet, but every instinct told me to dig deeper. Something was very wrong in Meadowbrook Estates, and my grandfather's barn was at the center of it all. I spent the next week becoming an amateur detective, something my software background oddly prepared me for. I'd always been good at finding patterns in data, and this situation was starting to look like a puzzle with missing pieces. I created a spreadsheet tracking every HOA action over the past 5 years, cross-referencing property sales, board member connections, and development projects in the area. Jennifer introduced me to a colleague named Robert Chen, a forensic accountant who specialized in corporate fraud. Robert was a quiet man in his early 40s, always carrying a worn leather briefcase and drinking green tea from a thermos. "Follow the money," he said during our first meeting at a coffee shop far from Meadowbrook. HOAs are non-profit organizations, which means their financial records are technically public. Let me see what I can find. Meanwhile, the harassment escalated. Someone spray-painted "Tear It Down" on the barn's side door. My car tires were slashed twice in 1 week. Anonymous letters appeared in my mailbox, not mailed but hand-delivered, warning me to take the deal and leave. What deal? The HOA had never offered me money, only threats and fines that now exceeded $15,000. Frank Morrison invited me over for coffee one morning after checking that no one was watching. His house smelled like pipe tobacco and old books. "I'm trusting you with something," he said, pulling out a worn manila folder from his desk drawer. "Your grandfather asked me to give you this if the HOA ever came after the barn. He knew something was wrong, Marcus. He just didn't have proof before he died." Inside the folder were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photographs. Grandpa had documented everything. The rezoning hearings in 1997 when the Meadowbrook development was approved, the suspicious speed at which agricultural land was converted to residential, the county commissioners who suddenly became wealthy around the same time. One note, in Grandpa's shaky handwriting from his final months, read, "The barn sits on something valuable. They've been trying to get this land for 20 years. Don't let them win, Marcus." Robert called me 2 days later, his voice tight with urgency. "Meet me at the old library on Jefferson Street. Don't use your phone to confirm. Just be there at 2 o'clock. When I arrived, he was sitting in a back corner with his laptop open, surrounded by printed documents. "Marcus, the Meadowbrook HOA has received over $2.3 million in payments from Titanium Development Corporation over the past 3 years. They're listed as consulting fees and community improvement grants, but there's no record of any improvements matching those amounts." He showed me bank statements he'd obtained through a Freedom of Information request. The HOA's nonprofit status made some records accessible. The pattern was clear. Every time a property owner disputed the HOA and eventually sold, a payment from Titanium followed within 30 days. "They're using HOA harassment to force property sales," Robert explained. "But why? What makes these specific properties valuable?" That's when I remembered something Grandpa had mentioned years ago. I'd been 14, helping him clean the barn, when he'd told me about the geological survey done in the 1980s. "They found something under this land," he'd said. "Came around asking to drill test holes. I said no. Some things are more important than money." I'd never thought much about it, until now. I drove to the county clerk's office and requested all geological surveys for my property's parcel number. The clerk, a woman named Martha who'd known my grandfather, leaned in close. "Honey, those records were sealed by court order in 1999. I can't give them to you without a judge's approval." But she slid a piece of paper across the counter with an old reference number. Sometimes the microfilm archives have copies that predate digital sealing. Just saying. In the dusty basement archive, I found it. A 1984 geological survey indicating significant rare earth mineral deposits beneath properties in what would become Meadowbrook Estates. These minerals, neodymium, europium, terbium, were worth millions, especially given their critical use in modern electronics, military applications, and green technology. The survey specifically noted my property as having exceptionally high concentrations at accessible depths. Suddenly, everything made sense. Titanium Development Corporation wasn't interested in building houses. They wanted mining rights. The HOA was their tool to force out property owners who stood in the way. Victoria Ashford, Richard Pemberton, Diana Sutton. They were all being paid to manufacture justifications for forcing sales. My barn wasn't ugly. It was just in the way of a multi-million-dollar mining operation. But I needed more proof, something concrete enough to take to authorities. That's when Meadowbrook Truth contacted me again, this time with a phone number and a message. Parking garage, 3rd and Main, level 4, tonight at 9 p.m. Come alone. I have documents that will end this. Jennifer insisted on accompanying me, parking her car 1 level below as backup. The garage was dimly lit and nearly empty. A figure emerged from behind a concrete pillar, a woman in her 30s wearing a hooded jacket and sunglasses despite the darkness. "I'm Sarah Brennan," she said quickly. "I was Victoria's assistant until last month. I couldn't stay quiet anymore." She handed me a USB drive, financial records, emails, recorded phone calls. Victoria and Titanium's CEO, Gregory Walsh, planned everything. They bribed the judge, threatened families, even paid county officials to rezone and seal geological reports. "This is everything you need." Sarah's hands shook as she spoke. "They're dangerous, Mr. Hayes. 2 families who fought back too hard. Their houses had mysterious fires. They called them accidents, but I heard Victoria on the phone coordinating with someone she called the contractor. Please be careful, and please stop them." She disappeared into the stairwell before I could ask more questions, leaving me holding what felt like dynamite in digital form. I didn't sleep that night. With Jennifer and Robert present in my living room, we went through Sarah Brennan's USB drive file by file. What we found was more damning than I'd imagined. Emails between Victoria Ashford and Gregory Walsh, CEO of Titanium Development, laid out their entire scheme with shocking candor. "The Hayes barn is the final obstacle," one email read. "Once demolished, we can consolidate the mineral rights and begin extraction. Project ROI estimated at $47 million over 10 years. There were spreadsheets tracking payoffs, $5,000 to Judge Harold Simmons for favorable rulings, monthly retainers to 3 county commissioners, and payments to a private investigation firm called Resolute Solutions for property owner pressure campaigns. The audio files were even worse. Recorded phone conversations where Victoria casually discussed fabricating code violations, hiring people to vandalize properties to drive down values, and celebrating when stubborn owners finally broke. One recording chilled me to my core. Gregory Walsh's voice, smooth and corporate. "Listen, Victoria, if the Hayes guy won't sell after the legal pressure, we'll need to consider more aggressive options. We've got too much invested to let one barn stand in our way. Contact our specialist. Make it look accidental. Structural failure, electrical fire, something insurance will cover. Just get it done." Victoria's response was equally cold. "Understood. I'll handle it." "They're planning to burn down your barn," Jennifer said, her face pale. "With you as potential collateral damage. Marcus, we need to go to the police immediately." But Robert was shaking his head, scrolling through more files. "Look at this. The police chief, Thomas Hartley, received $3,000 from a consulting contract with Titanium, and the county sheriff's department got a donation of $2,000 for new equipment. We can't trust local law enforcement. They're compromised." I felt trapped, angry, and terrified all at once. These people had corrupted an entire system to steal land and threaten lives for profit. How does one person fight that kind of power? Jennifer stood up, pacing the room. "We need to go federal. This isn't just property fraud, it's racketeering, bribery of public officials, conspiracy, possibly even attempted murder. This is FBI territory." Robert agreed. "With this evidence, we have a RICO case, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Titanium Corporation is using the HOA as a criminal enterprise. The FBI's white-collar crime division would be very interested in this." He started making notes. "We need to document everything, create redundant backups, and make sure this evidence reaches the right people, even if something happens to us." The next morning, Jennifer contacted a federal prosecutor she'd worked with years ago on a corporate fraud case. Margaret Thornton was a legend in legal circles, a woman in her 50s who'd brought down 2 state senators and a major pharmaceutical company for price fixing. We met her in a federal building downtown, going through multiple security checkpoints. Margaret listened to our presentation for 2 hours, her expression growing progressively grimmer. "This is significant," she finally said, "but I need to verify these recordings are authentic and these documents haven't been altered. If everything checks out, I'll bring in the FBI immediately. In the meantime, Mr. Hayes, you're in danger. These people have already demonstrated willingness to commit violence. I'm arranging protective surveillance for you starting tonight." She made several calls while we waited, speaking in low tones about assets and field teams. 2 days later, Margaret called with confirmation. "We've authenticated the evidence. The FBI's Corruption and Civil Rights Division is opening a formal investigation. They're also bringing in the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network because of the money laundering implications. All those HOA payments were routed through shell companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands." She paused. Marcus, I need you to do something difficult. We need more evidence, particularly on the attempted arson plan. We need them to act, but in a controlled environment where we can catch them. The plan was dangerous but necessary. I would publicly announce at the next HOA meeting that I was refusing to demolish the barn and challenging their authority with new legal action. This would, theoretically, trigger their aggressive options while FBI agents conducted surveillance. We'll have agents in the barn, around your property, and embedded in the community, explained Special Agent David Morrison, a stern man in his 40s who headed the operation. The moment anyone attempts arson or assault, we apprehend them. Then we leverage arrests to roll up the entire conspiracy. Frank Morrison, no relation to Agent Morrison, offered additional help. I've got security cameras from my contracting days, he said. Military-grade motion sensors, too. Let me wire your barn properly. If anyone comes near it, we'll have them on video from 5 angles. Frank worked for 2 days installing hidden cameras in the barn's rafters, motion detectors in the surrounding trees, and infrared sensors near all entrances. Your grandfather would be proud, he told me, fighting for what's right, even when it's dangerous. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center. I spent the day reviewing my statement with Jennifer, trying to control the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Margaret had been clear. Make them angry enough to act, but don't provoke violence in the meeting itself. We need them to incriminate themselves through their criminal response, not assault you in public. As I drove to the community center that evening, I saw the unmarked FBI vehicles positioned strategically throughout the neighborhood. People who looked like residents washing cars, walking dogs, or sitting on porches. All of them were armed federal agents. The barn was under 24-hour watch. Everything was in place. I was about to walk into a room full of conspirators and criminals, look them in the eye, and tell them I wouldn't back down. What I didn't know yet was that their response would be far more immediate and far more dramatic than anyone anticipated. The Meadowbrook Estates Community Center buzzed with tension when I arrived. About 40 residents filled the folding chairs, some looking at me with sympathy, others with obvious disdain. Victoria Ashford sat at the head table with Richard Pemberton and Diana Sutton, their expressions radiating confidence. They thought they'd already won. Behind me, I knew Jennifer was recording everything on her phone, backed up to a cloud server the FBI was monitoring in real time. Victoria called the meeting to order with a sharp gavel strike. We have several items on tonight's agenda, but first, let's address the ongoing situation with Mr. Hayes and the non-compliant structure on his property. She made non-compliant structure sound like I was harboring toxic waste instead of a historic barn. Mr. Hayes, your fines now total $8,500. We've been more than patient. Do you have a demolition timeline to present to this board? I stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room on me. I'm not demolishing the barn, I said clearly. Furthermore, I'm filing a federal lawsuit against this HOA for harassment, abuse of authority, and violation of my property rights. That barn predates your organization by decades, and I have legal precedent on my side. The room erupted in murmurs. Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment before returning, tighter than before. Mr. Hayes, you're making a serious mistake, she said. This board has unanimous support from Meadowbrook residents and full legal authority granted by our covenant. A covenant, I might add, that was legally recorded and applies to all properties in this subdivision regardless of construction date. Diana Sutton leaned forward, her voice cold and precise. Your grandfather signed an agreement in 1998 acknowledging the HOA's authority when the subdivision was formed. That signature binds all subsequent property owners. I'd been prepared for this. That agreement was signed under duress, and I have evidence that my grandfather was threatened into compliance. I also have evidence that this HOA has systematically violated its own fiduciary duties, engaged in financial misconduct, and colluded with outside interests to deprive property owners of their legal rights. Victoria's face went rigid. Richard Pemberton gripped the table edge, his knuckles white. Those are serious allegations, Victoria said, her voice dangerously quiet. Allegations you cannot possibly prove. She glanced at someone in the back row, a large man in a leather jacket I didn't recognize. He nodded slightly and left through the side exit. This meeting is adjourned. The board will be filing a lien against your property tomorrow, Mr. Hayes. When you can't pay, we'll foreclose. You'll lose everything your grandfather built, including that precious barn. As the room cleared, several residents approached me with quiet words of support. We've been afraid to speak up, one elderly woman whispered. They've bullied so many families. Another man, a father of 3, said, Thank you for fighting back. Someone needed to. But others glared at me with genuine hostility, completely bought into Victoria's narrative that I was the problem, not the solution. I left the meeting with Jennifer, both of us silent until we reached our cars. That went exactly as Margaret predicted, Jennifer said. Victoria's scared. She practically telegraphed that they're moving to the next phase. Her phone buzzed, a text from Agent Morrison. Subject of interest left through side exit, heading toward target property. All units be advised. My heart rate spiked. It was happening tonight. I drove home with an FBI escort vehicle trailing at a discreet distance. The barn looked peaceful in the moonlight, showing no signs of the surveillance operation surrounding it. Frank was waiting on his porch, watching. I gave him a subtle thumbs up, our agreed signal that everything was proceeding according to plan. Inside my house, I tried to act naturally, making dinner I couldn't eat, watching television I didn't process. Around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Agent Morrison. 3 subjects approaching barn from western perimeter, carrying containers consistent with accelerants. All teams hold position until criminal intent is established. Do not approach your barn under any circumstances. I watched from my darkened living room window, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Through Frank's military-grade cameras, the FBI had a clear view. 3 men in dark clothing moved cautiously toward the barn, one of them the large man from the HOA meeting. They were carrying gas cans and what looked like timing devices. One man circled the barn, apparently checking for witnesses, while another forced open the side door. The third began pouring liquid along the barn's foundation. Gasoline, undoubtedly. "Move in!" Agent Morrison's voice crackled through the radio I'd been given. Suddenly, the night exploded with activity. High-intensity lights flooded the area as FBI agents emerged from concealed positions. "FBI, drop the containers and get on the ground now!" The 3 men froze, then tried to run. They made it maybe 10 feet before being tackled by agents in tactical gear. Within minutes, all 3 were handcuffed and being read their rights. But the operation wasn't over. Agent Morrison's team had been tracking phone communications all evening. The moment the arsonists were arrested, they executed simultaneous search warrants at Victoria Ashford's home, Titanium Development Corporation's offices, and the homes of Richard Pemberton and Diana Sutton. Margaret Thornton had convinced a federal judge that there was imminent risk of evidence destruction once the arsonists were apprehended. I watched from my window as the arsonist who'd attended the HOA meeting began talking immediately, apparently deciding cooperation was preferable to facing arson and attempted murder charges alone. Agent Morrison came to my door an hour later, his expression grim but satisfied. "Mr. Hayes, we've arrested 8 people tonight, including the 3 would-be arsonists and 5 individuals we caught attempting to destroy financial records at Titanium Corporation. We've seized computers, documents, and recorded phone calls from Victoria Ashford's home office where she was actively deleting files when agents arrived." He showed me his tablet with photographs of Victoria being led out of her house in handcuffs, her perfect composure finally shattered. Richard Pemberton had apparently tried to flee in his Mercedes before being stopped at a roadblock. Diana Sutton was threatening lawsuits even as agents confiscated boxes of documents from her home. We're also arresting Judge Simmons and 2 county commissioners in the morning. The next 72 hours felt surreal. News vans crowded Meadowbrook Estates as reporters scrambled to cover what journalists were calling one of the most brazen corruption schemes in recent North Carolina history. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, which Jennifer advised me to decline until after the legal proceedings concluded. "Let the evidence speak," she said. "Your time to tell your story will come." Federal prosecutors worked around the clock building their case. Margaret Thornton held a press conference on the federal building steps, flanked by FBI agents and state officials. "Today we're announcing charges against 14 individuals and 2 corporations in connection with a racketeering conspiracy involving bribery, extortion, fraud, money laundering, and attempted arson," she declared to a sea of cameras. This investigation revealed a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used a homeowners association as a front to illegally acquire valuable mineral rights through intimidation, corruption of public officials, and systematic property rights violations. She detailed the charges. Victoria Ashford faced 19 federal counts including RICO violations, conspiracy, bribery, and solicitation to commit arson. Gregory Walsh and 3 titanium development executives were charged with similar counts, plus securities fraud for misleading investors about their land acquisition methods. Judge Harold Simmons was arrested at his courthouse chambers, charged with accepting bribes and corruption of justice. The 3 county commissioners were charged with honest services fraud and accepting illegal payments. The arsonists, identified as contractors hired by a company called Resolute Solutions, which turned out to be Titanium's security subsidiary, were cooperating fully. The man from the HOA meeting, Derek Collins, provided detailed testimony about how he and his team had been paid $5,000 to eliminate the barn and make it look accidental. He described similar jobs they'd done on 2 other properties, including one fire that had destroyed a family's home while they slept. "We were told the family was on vacation," Derek said in his recorded confession, his voice shaking. "If anyone had died, I can't believe what we almost did." The financial investigation uncovered staggering depth of corruption. Over $8.7 million had flowed from titanium development through various shell companies to HOA members, public officials, and the arson crew over 5 years. The geological surveys I'd found were just the beginning. Titanium had secretly acquired mineral rights to 17 other properties through intimidation and fraudulent sales, estimating the total value of extractable rare earth minerals at over $200 million. Robert Chen's forensic accounting revealed that Victoria Ashford personally received $38,000 in consulting fees, money she'd used to purchase a luxury condo in Florida and a BMW. Richard Pemberton had received $19,000, which he'd invested in Titanium's parent company stock, a detail that added insider trading charges to his indictment. Diana Sutton, as the corporate attorney who'd structured many of the shell companies and fraudulent contracts, faced the most serious legal exposure besides the executives themselves. What shocked me most was learning about the other victims. Federal investigators identified 11 families who'd been forced from their homes through the HOA harassment scheme. One couple, the Johnsons, had lost their home of 20 years after accruing $65,000 in fraudulent HOA fines and being forced into bankruptcy. Another family, the Rodriguezes, had sold at a 40% loss after their teenage daughter was cyberbullied by people later found to be paid by Resolute Solutions. These weren't just property crimes, they were life-destroying assaults on good people. The FBI organized a victims meeting at a hotel conference room. About 30 people attended. Former Meadowbrook residents who'd been driven out, current residents who'd been too afraid to resist, and their families. I shared my story and then listened to theirs. A veteran named James Patterson broke down describing how he'd lost his dream retirement home after fighting the HOA over solar panels. "They made me feel crazy," he said, "like I was the unreasonable one for wanting to use solar energy on my own roof. Now I know it was all a coordinated attack because my property sat on valuable mineral deposits." Sarah Brennan attended the meeting too, no longer hiding. She'd entered witness protection temporarily due to threats from Titanium associates who remained at large, but she wanted to face the people she'd helped victimize. "I'm so sorry," she told the group, tears streaming down her face. "I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid of losing my job, of what Victoria might do. That's no excuse. I should have come forward sooner before families were destroyed. I have to live with that." Sarah Brennan attended the meeting too, no longer hiding. She'd entered witness protection temporarily due to threats from Titanium associates who remained at large, but she wanted to face the people she'd helped victimize. "I'm so sorry," she told the group, tears streaming down her face. "I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid of losing my job, of what Victoria might do. That's no excuse. I should have come forward sooner before families were destroyed. I have to live with that." The room was silent. Then James Patterson stood and hugged her. "You did the right thing eventually," he said. "That takes courage too." Meanwhile, the legal dominoes continued falling. 3 police officers who'd ignored complaints about HOA harassment were suspended pending internal investigations. The real estate company that had processed many of the forced sales was under scrutiny for potential complicity. Even the bank that had financed Titanium's land acquisitions faced questions about their due diligence on suspicious transactions. My own situation transformed dramatically. The HOA dissolved itself overnight. The remaining board members who weren't under indictment resigned en masse and voted to terminate the organization entirely. All outstanding fines and liens were voided by emergency court order. Property values had plummeted due to the scandal, but Margaret assured affected homeowners that restitution would be part of any plea agreements or trial convictions. Frank Morrison became something of a local hero, with neighbors thanking him for installing the security system that captured the arsonists in the act. "I just helped a friend," he'd say modestly. But I knew better. Frank had believed in fighting corruption even when it seemed hopeless, even when 3 families before me had been defeated. The barn stood untouched through it all, a silent witness to everything that had happened. I spent an afternoon repainting the weathered sections, this time without fear of HOA letters or arson attempts. As I worked, neighbors I'd never met stopped by to apologize for not supporting me earlier, to share their own stories of HOA intimidation, or simply to say thank you for exposing what had been happening in their community. One elderly woman brought me lemonade and homemade cookies. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said. "He'd be proud of you for protecting what he built. Not just the barn, the principle of standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they seem." The trials began 6 months later, though most defendants accepted plea agreements rather than face juries. Victoria Ashford, maintaining her innocence longest, finally pleaded guilty to racketeering, conspiracy, and bribery in exchange for a reduced sentence. She received 12 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay $2.1 million in restitution. Watching her sentencing, I felt no joy, only a sad recognition of how greed had destroyed her life and harmed so many others. Gregory Walsh, Titanium's CEO, went to trial and was convicted on 17 counts. His sentence, 25 years in federal prison and $47 million in fines and restitution, effectively bankrupting both him and his company. Titanium Development Corporation collapsed into bankruptcy, its assets seized and liquidated to compensate victims. The judge's words at sentencing were scathing. "You corrupted public institutions, destroyed families, and treated people's homes as obstacles to profit. You showed no remorse until facing imprisonment. This court must send a message that such calculated criminality will face the full weight of justice." Judge Harold Simmons received 8 years and was permanently disbarred. The county commissioners received sentences ranging from 5 to 7 years. Diana Sutton, who'd orchestrated much of the legal framework for the scheme, received 15 years despite her cooperation with investigators. Richard Pemberton, whose health had deteriorated during the proceedings, received a 10-year sentence with provisions for medical care. The arsonists received varying sentences based on cooperation. Derek Collins, who'd testified extensively, received 5 years. His 2 accomplices, who'd been involved in the earlier fire that destroyed the family home, received 12 years each. Resolute Solutions was criminally dissolved, its corporate charter revoked by the state. For the victims, justice came in forms beyond imprisonment. A $31 million restitution fund was established from seized assets, criminal fines, and civil settlements. The Johnsons received $89,000, enough to buy back a home and recover their losses. The Rodriguezes received $65,000 and emotional apology from federal prosecutors acknowledging how the system had failed them. James Patterson received $42,000 and immediately donated a portion to a legal aid fund Margaret established to help homeowners fight HOA abuse.